Hi, this is Mark Pikita. One of the themes of our campaign is to leave Ohio better than we found it. On September 29th, we did just that. We held a forum at Miami University on forced vaccinations. I spoke, as did Chris Hicks, and a lawyer by the name of Matt Miller-Novak. Matt went to the University of Cincinnati. Chris went to Miami University. They poked fun at each other about who went to the better school. I went to The Ohio State University. You know, the school that wins a lot of championships. So I didn't have to get involved in their petty banter. I hope this video is helpful to you.
It's Chris Hicks. How many people here, it looks like we're pretty much all students? Everybody a student? How many people here went to Miami that are not students? Okay, so I graduated in 1988. My wife, who's BJ right there, graduated in 1989. I have my Miami merger mask, in case I got told to wear a mask here, that was sent out from my wife is an artist, so we're my Miami mergers, and I love getting the cards, the Miami merger cards, because then I can mock and ridicule the creative department at Miami. I was an accounting major. Yeah. So it's a real job. Okay, so anyway, so what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about vaccine exemptions, both religious, medical, conscience, both from an employee standpoint and from a student standpoint. And we actually had this room booked for another event a while back, and the vaccine mandate didn't even exist at the time we booked the place. And so we thought, we really actually didn't need the place, but we thought, as long as we have the place booked, why don't we do something about vaccine mandates? And this is Mark Pikita. He's running for U.S. Senate for Rob Portman's seat. He is going to talk in a minute. He's the only candidate that entered the race prior to Rob Portman dropping out, which is something important to remember. So, in the mix. So, here's kind of the agenda we're going to follow. I'm giving you the welcome right now. Then Mark's going to talk. Then we're going to talk about Miami and its vaccine mandate. I will talk about that a little bit. And then we're going to talk about vaccine exemption law. And Matt Miller-Novak over here, which is a friend of mine. I don't know if you're a friend of mine, Matt. We've worked together on, he's a great lawyer from Cincinnati. He's politically different than me. Like, we're different views, but a lot of times that's where you get the best results, when you have different political views come together. He's a great defender of civil rights and civil liberties in his work as a lawyer, including working directly with me and protecting my rights and civil liberties. And then we'll have open discussion. Now, we're supposed to have some food come. So what we're going to do, what I thought we'd do just for sake of time, because there's some sorority party or something like that coming in after us. There's some other group coming in here at 8. And I think we're free to stay if we want. I don't know, but I don't know who they are. Okay? So I just wanted to keep us on track time-wise here, knowing that there's another group coming in at 8. So when the food comes, we'll take a quick break for everybody to get food, because we got enough food for everybody. So load up and grab some food, and then we'll take a break for doing that as well. So with that, I am going to introduce my friend, U.S. Senate candidate Mark Pikita. And Mark, did you notice I'm wearing a Pikita hat? I almost never, it's the first time you saw me wearing a Pikita thing, but I'm getting more on the team. I've been on the team for like 20 weeks or so. And just a quick story before I have him up here. He came to, I had a Republican club in Claremont County. And he came to a cornhole event. There was a guy that got really into Mark, and he asked me to come to an event that Mark was doing. And I came to the event, and driving back to the event, I said to my friend, he did 14 things wrong during that event. Okay? And then he's like, well, why don't you call him and talk to him? So I called him and I told him. Anybody knows me knows I'm a very critical guy. My son here, I'm a very critical guy. So I laid out for him, here's the 14 things you did wrong. I think it was actually 18. I'm trying to make it gentler. It was 14. Then somewhere after that I texted him, and he texted me back, he said, after I pulled myself up, after I revived myself with smelling salts, got my stitches and wounds back, got stitches in my wounds bound, pulled myself up from the floor and got my wits about me, I realized everything you told me was right. And one of the things I think we lack in political leadership is people that listen, and people versus tell us the way it should be. Is listen and learn and grow. Mark is a business leader, not a politician. His first time running for office. So with that, I'm going to bring up Mark Pikita to tell you a little bit about himself and and then hopefully the food will be here, and we'll take a food break. There you go, Mark.
Thanks. What Chris forgot to tell you about booking this room is we had a deposit down that we weren't going to get back. And so he's like, let's find a way to use that deposit, because he's always looking out for my money, because I'm putting a lot of my own money into this campaign, as you might imagine. So I'm Mark Pikita. I'd like to be your next U.S. Ohio Senator. I am probably one of the least likely people that you would see running for U.S. Senate, because I had absolutely zero desire to do anything in politics until October of 2019. In October of 2019, I sold a big company that I built from scratch. I started it in my, what was then unfinished basement with $1,000 of my own money. I came from a lower middle class family. I went to Ohio State. I graduated with honors with the engineering degree, which is a little bit more challenging than an accounting degree at Miami, but I was at Ohio State, so you got to factor that in. People from Miami seem to think that they're important. So it's better, yeah, better. So I went to work for companies like IBM and EDS. I worked for Ross Perot, love the guy. Never asked anybody to do anything he wouldn't do business-wise or job-wise. He was awesome. And he was tough, but he cared, and he was a good guy. And it would have been interesting if he had been our president. So I started my company in '96, grew it, and in October of 2019, I sold the company, and it was at that time I realized I'd lived the American dream, right? I'm seeing wires of money come in to my bank account. I realized I've done better than my parents, who did better than their parents. Now that wasn't hard, because both of my grandfathers were coal miners in northeastern Pennsylvania. My parents, when they were kids, had outhouses, right? I did not come from a wealthy family. And so I realized I lived the American dream. I was like, wow. And it was really interesting. The interesting part about this was living the American dream hit me after it was over. I never thought, wow, I want to live the American dream, right? I'm going to go live the American dream. Because you just take it for granted in the United States, right? You want to go start a business, you just go do it. You got enough capital, you got the risk profile, you got the idea, you just go do it. I have traveled around the world. I have been in many countries, including places like Russia, okay? Out in the hinterland. There is no place else on earth where you can do that. I lived in Canada for 4 years. There are many more regulatory hurdles there. In every other country, it's who you know, what's your family name, who are you going to pay off. All right, so I'm a patriot. I love this country. It's the greatest country in the world. And I'll just leave it at that. So I'm selling my company. I realized I lived the American dream. And I had, at that time, a 17-month-old grandson. And I'm looking at him thinking there is no way he will be able to have the same opportunity I did with a much better start than I had. Much better. 2 college-educated parents who are earning plenty of money, and they're just, doing the right things with him and now his brother educationally. And I thought they will not have the same opportunity I had to live the American dream. If we keep going in the same direction we're going. So that's why I chose to run. And as Chris said, he didn't tell you the other part about Rob Portman. I had seen Rob Portman doing an interview on TV about that same time. And I realized he hasn't done a single thing we sent him to Washington to do. Not a single thing. So I am the furthest thing from a career politician, swamp creature, insider. We're now in a battle of insiders versus outsiders. It isn't Republican, Democrat. It isn't left and right. If you really look at it, it's insiders versus outsiders. People who feel they've got the upper hand, and those of us who feel that we're getting screwed. And I've traveled to all the 88 counties. Everybody that I'm talking to feels this way, and they are angry. One of the themes of our campaign is we want to leave Ohio better than we found it. So I feel like I'm working two jobs. I'm campaigning like every other candidate, but we're also doing things to impact Ohio that make it better. So we'll talk about some of these, but it's a real thing. We're not just talking about it. You'll see, I'll tell you some of the things we've done. We are fighting corruption in what I like to call bad stuff. Okay, so up in the upper left-hand corner, we did a press conference at the governor's mansion, which we believe caused him to cancel what we call a bribe picnic, trying to get an endorsement from a corrupt Ohio Republican Party. So I'm a Republican, right? And we are taking on the Republican Party. I will tell you, they despise me for this, okay? Upper right, I've testified in front of the Ohio School Board twice. I now believe that we don't need an Ohio Board of Education. They are worthless, and they are nasty, condescending, arrogant, and dismissive. They think that they work for us, not the other way around. And you can go watch those videos and choose, you can decide for yourself. It's stunning, I believe, the way they treated me. And I was very chill with them. I was more chill than I am with you right now. We were here, so the bottom left is another issue. We got issue in the Ohio Republican Party. We got about $2 million that they can't seem to figure out where it went, and they don't want to have an audit done. So we're pressing them for that. My attitude is, as a Republican, we need to clean up our own house before we go to demolish theirs, right? We've got so much hypocrisy right now in everything, not just government, education, media, everything. And I wasn't raised that way. I despise it. And then in the bottom right, here at Miami, doing a press conference about masking and vaccine. I'm not going to talk much about this. I've got an agenda. I'm the only candidate that has been talking intensely about policy, and there are like 11 of us for 2 years. Nobody else wants to talk about policy because they don't want to put a stake in the ground and have to be held responsible for their beliefs and their policies. And you've got a copy of that on the backs that I gave out. If you haven't gotten that, we've got some for you. I am looking for on-the-record commitments. I come from a business background. I've never run for office before. In business, we sign contracts. You will give me this much money and I will do this for you, and if I don't, I pay the penalty. So we came up with this candidate pledge that says, here's what I'm going to do when I've signed it. We've given it to every other Senate candidate. They've had it forever. They refuse to sign it. Right? They won't sign it. They will not put a commitment on paper and tell you what they're going to do. And I don't know why we as voters haven't required this of elected officials prior to this. We're fighting absolute insanity in public schools with things like critical race theory, social emotional learning, early sexualization of children. I mean, it is absolutely unbelievable what's going on in our school systems right now. So we came up with this thing called a contract with the district, and it's very much like that Senate pledge. We're trying to force out issues, how candidates stand, how board members stand, how board members who are up for re-election stand, and then how new candidates stand. To find out on those 11 issues, there used to be 10, but masks are back. We thought masks were done. We didn't have masks on here, now masks are back. But it's a tool you can use with your school board members and candidates to figure out where they stand on issues. I will tell you, if you take this to most people, they will not respond. I was in front of the Dublin School Board. I've been in front of many school boards around the state. They just won't respond. They won't tell you what they think or believe because they've been trained that way by the Ohio School Board Association, and I won't even go into that, but they're being programmed. And then we're fighting rigged primaries. The Ohio Republican Party should not be endorsing candidates for the primary. It's a sacred right for voters to pick their candidate in a primary election. And they game the system with primaries, which gives people who they hand select, the insiders, money, staff, and name recognition through slate cards. It's a dirty rigged game and it's got to stop. And then we're fighting force. You know, a school like Miami with a mandate for your child or for you if you're a student to get vaccinated is forced because they're like, if you don't get vaccinated, you've got to leave. Or if you don't get vaccinated, you've got to get, depending on the school, you've got to get vaccinated, you've got to get masked, you've got to get tested. That is unacceptable to me, right? I just tell it like it is. What you see is what you get. And this is just unacceptable to me. So we did a press conference here and did that. And then finally, we're trying to help Ohioans. And that's why we're here tonight. So I want to thank you for coming. I hope this is valuable for you. And if it is, let us know. And if we need to do something like this again, we probably won't have to because we're going to video it. Maybe you can share the video with your friends and colleagues and family members and community members who have an issue with this. But here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to sugarcoat things, and we're not going to blow smoke. You're going to hear from Matt the way it really is. There's a lot of false hope on everything today, a lot of misinformation. Chris said, don't say misinformation, but I just said it. But you're going to get the real scoop from Matt on what you can and can't do. Forget about as we were talking, forget about Facebook, forget about social media. This guy's a lawyer, he's been called to the bar, he does this for a living, and he's going to tell us what works and what doesn't. Is he next? I'm not used to self-promoting, right? I'm used to promoting a company and a brand, not myself, so it's awkward for me. If you want to learn more about me, then this night is not about me, but you can go to mark4ohio.com, mark4ohio.com, and you can find out a lot about me.
All right, so Matt and I were talking about how while we're getting food, how he's taught some classes here, and he's observed that Miami people just seem better. So he was honored to have been in their presence teaching a class. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the vaccine mandate here. By the way, I already said my wife is a Miami merger. My son over there is a Miami senior, and you have been vaccinated, which I found out from Mom. Okay, so, I'm a person that, he's an adult, he's 18, he can make his own decisions. So nothing about what we're talking about, or Mr. Pikita would talk about, is implying, you can't, I think we're about people making their own decisions. And I think Matt Novak is about people having accurate information when they make their own decisions. I always am amazed, I'm a super conservative guy, and I'm always amazed at how many constitutional scholars there are teaching constitution classes that are not lawyers and have never practiced constitutional law and don't realize that even though we all treasure the Constitution, it is affected by hundreds of years of Supreme Court rulings that directly relate to how those things are read and interpreted in the Constitution. Okay? And eventually I'm going to show a new statute in Ohio that's going to give you a good example of how legislators do a terrible job sometimes writing the laws and putting the courts in a very awkward position when it comes to even understanding the laws, and we'll see that in a second. Okay, so I got on August 31st, I think Justin got it earlier, the note from Miami saying they were going to have a vaccine mandate. They hadn't all figured it out, and there was going to be an exemption form available in 2 weeks for that vaccine mandate. And if you focus on reading this part, you'll understand the key part. You can't read it, I'm going to flip to a chart where you can read it, okay? But, so, it talks about exclusions, and it says the claimant exclusion for reasons of conscious or religious belief, individuals must complete documentation, affirming a sincerely held belief, acknowledging the risk of serious illness, and agreeing to comply with health and safety requirements to best protect the community and themselves, including exemption form must be submitted by October 15th to allow for review prior to the October 25th deadline, blah, blah, blah. The exemption form will be available in the next 2 weeks. Students who do not receive an approved exemption or deferral do not share reading is, Matt, don't use this to judge my English. I can actually read well. Do not share proof of vaccination will not be able to register for classes for the spring semester. Employees who choose not to be vaccinated and who do not receive an approved exemption by October 25th, 21 are subject to disciplinary measures. Further, many of our external partners are also requiring the vaccine. Current students engaged in internships, student teaching, nursing practicums, and other similar engagements will need to work directly with those organizations to comply with their specific requirements. An exemption from Miami will not fulfill any requirement that an external aid organization has in place. So that was the August 31st communication from Miami University. Then there was a September 15th, 2 weeks later, when the form was supposed to be available, communication. I highlighted the yellow part here. I'm going to put that on the chart. And this means it wasn't, I'm a very accurate guy. This means it wasn't, I'm not continuously reading from that document. This is a separate excerpt. It said students must first complete a brief Healthy Together 2021 education module to access the exemption form. The module will take approximately 10 to 15 minutes to complete. The exemption form is available upon completion of the module. So to get the form, you have to do the exemption module in the first place. There will be a separate form and review process for medical exemptions, deferrals, and non-medical exemptions, which were what? Conscience and religious were the two non-medical. And then it says students and employees who are not vaccinated will be required to participate in the university's testing program and will be required to quarantine for 10 days if they are determined to have been in contact with someone who has tested positive for the COVID-19 virus. So that's all in that communication. So I went to, this was actually a hyperlink in the communication for the Healthy Together 2021 educational module. As a parent who has a login to the system, my login is focused, Justin, your logins for different things. My login is focused on paying bills. This is where you log in to pay the bill. They make that very, actually, if you have a kid that goes to Miami, they can do a lot to improve that. I always go in there, it takes me like 10 minutes to figure out where to go in the system to actually pay the bill. But I would click on that, I signed on, and then I found out that as a parent, I can't see the module and I can't see the form. Okay? Because my form, now, some kids in college are minors still. My kid is not a minor. Okay, but parents can't see the form. So then I went out and looked for a form. And the funny thing is Miami, and I'm hitting this because I think probably every public college in Ohio is probably the same. Okay? So Miami has a form already, and it's had for years. Well, it was modified here. But this is their vaccine exemption form for all kind of other vaccines that are required. So hepatitis B, measles, mumps, rubella, meningitis, polio, tetanus, blah, blah, blah. So they already had an exemption form. And you can get that, that's easy to find. I can find that form in a second out there, the regular form for vaccine requirement exemption. The form for the parents can't see, I would go look online trying to find a copy. Had I thought about it earlier, I would have done a public records request to the university, Matt, for both the module and the form, okay? Because you're entitled to do that. Those are public information, okay? Even though they're behind a password-protected system. Somebody had put online the religious exemption form, and you really can't read it. You can barely read it in the version they have, but you have to write an essay on your religious exemption. There's an affidavit thing you have to do. There's check boxes that you have to fill out on your religious exemption. Okay? So I don't know what the conscience exemption form looks like or the medical exemption form looks like, but they sure do make it hard to get there. And regardless of how you feel politically about, or how you feel about the vaccine, the notion in our country that we keep having things hidden like this, when the form for regular vaccine exemptions, anybody can go see it. You don't have to get, but this form, for some reason, is top secret and a parent's not even allowed to see it, what the forms are. It is more, I have a friend over here sitting and he'd say, Mark, rarely, I'm a pain in This is morally and ethically wrong.
Amen.
To be hiding these things from parents, to be hiding them from the general community, to not make them available. I'm a Christian, and I strongly believe that which you are proud of, you tell people about it. You brag about it. Mr. Pikita was up here bragging about he wasn't bragging, he was talking about his company, okay? That which you are ashamed of, you tend not to talk about. You tend to hide. You tend to want to keep secret, okay? There's a question.
I actually did the form with my son, so I was right next to him. And it's not even that form. It's an actual all online form.
Okay, after they go through it. And was it a religious, medical, or conscious?
Or religious.
Religious, okay. So the form, apparently your son had done the healthy something module to be able to get access to the forms? Okay. All right. So I did go online and look at what does it say on the site right now about vaccine exemptions on their publicly visible site. And it talks about, this is where it says the same thing about having to take the Healthy 2021 education module. And then, are there any exemptions? I clipped things out of that web page. Are there any exemptions? Exemptions may be granted for the following reasons: medical with documentation, or sincerely held religious beliefs, practices or observations, or reasons of conscience, including philosophical or ethical beliefs. Matt, the attorney, is quite cringing at that language, because what does it mean? Legally, what does that language mean? And we might talk about that some, because it's very loose as to what that language means. What health conditions qualify for a medical exemption? Your healthcare provider should help you to determine whether you have a health condition preventing you from getting vaccinated. They can provide the documentation to support your request, okay? What is meant by reasons of conscience or religious belief? Reasons of conscience include any sincerely held philosophical, ethical, religious basis for not taking the vaccine. Your exemption request must include an articulated religious, ethical, or philosophical basis for refusing vaccine, and that demonstrates you are making an informed decision, okay? So now in America, we're not allowed to just make our own decisions. We have to demonstrate to the governmental authority that we're allowed to make that decision, or we did that decision the way they felt we should. The thing that's so funny about this to me is, does a philosophical or ethical, does that include political? So does that include, can a political belief cause you to not do this, or what does it mean otherwise? What if I already have a medical or religious exemption or other vaccine? This is from a separate section. You do not need to submit an exemption for the COVID-19 vaccination if you already have a medical or religious exemption on file for other vaccinations, which I assume means you use the original form that is publicly available to achieve an exemption. Okay, so if you had done that form before COVID, the way I read this, if you had done that exemption form, the simple version where you don't have to take a module before COVID, you're good to go. But if you now want to do it, you have to take a module and you have to fill out a longer form than that form. Okay? And if I get an exemption, will I be subject to additional healthy and safety requirements? Yes. I'm vaccinated, I won't read all this, blah, blah, blah. Yes. We don't know what that means. Yes, you're going to have to do more. Why are you allowing individuals to be exempted? I always think that's funny, like, how is this even possible? These people that want to kill everybody by being exempted from something. Okay, and so I'm not going to read that part, but why are you even allowing this? So one of the things, now Matt is going to get up here, and he is going to talk about the law, and originally I was talking to a lawyer about doing this presentation that was a conservative activist type lawyer, which Matt is not a conservative activist type lawyer, and so then I talked to Matt, the person couldn't do it because of a schedule conflict. Then I talked to Matt and asked him if he could do it. And then I started talking to him about vaccines and vaccine exemption. And I learned that actually this is a very well-formed part of law already. This has been going on for a long time. There's been people, we all know that there have been anti-vaxxers forever, right? For as long as I've been alive, that don't want their kids to get vaccinated on something in schools. So there's a lot of, now Matt's like, okay. On the phone with me, Matt made me think that there have been a lot of case law and things like that around exemptions and so forth. But one of the things I think that hamstrings somebody like Matt difference between what a university might grant, was yours granted? Okay? What they might grant and what would happen if it went to court. If they chose to fight it in court, where would you be left? And I think you're going to talk more from the perspective of, from a court legal standpoint, what would likely happen if you tried to put forward thinking they were fighting back. But this is the most screwball thing that throws a curveball into the whole situation, is there is a new statute that takes effect on October 13th, which is the day after my birthday. And that statute is worded like basically people with some sort of mental impairment wrote the statute. And it affects vaccine mandates at colleges and in public schools. And it might make it harder for Matt to talk about what he's going to talk about, but he's going to talk about here's what's happened so far. But this statute's like a crazy thing in the middle of this whole thing. And regardless how you feel about vaccines and exemptions, I think anybody that reads these could agree this is like idiots wrote it. Okay, and I'm going to show you why it's like idiots wrote it. Are people familiar with that there's this new statute, ORC 379204? How many people heard of that before? Okay, it takes effect October 13th. By our dazzling legislature, who has not met. They just started meeting. They had not met for 3 months. They had not met for 3 months. Because, there was nothing pressing that Ohioans cared about in the last 3 months. And they just like, what the hell? We'll just take a break. No, it's to protect, how do you feel? You don't have to feel the way I do. It's to protect Governor DeWine from people in the legislature putting through legislation by not even meeting. To me, it's complete banana republic stuff. The legislature doesn't meet. Okay, so to get things done. But this, you might want to look this up, 379204. And it has a section in it, and it says, notwithstanding any conflicting provision of the revised code, a public school or state institution of higher learning shall not do either of the following. So remember, that's the first negative, shall not do. Even at Miami, they taught like double negatives and what the hell does this mean, that thing. And you need to write this down on paper. Shall not do it in the following. 1, require an individual to receive a vaccine for which the United States Food and Drug Administration has not granted full approval. 2, discriminate against an individual who has not received the vaccine described in Division B1 of this section, right here, including by requiring the individual to engage in or refrain from engaging in activities or precautions that differ from the activities or precautions of an individual who has received such vaccine. So you got 3 negatives. Shall not.
Doesn't apply to this vaccine?
So I think it'll probably be a court at some point that determines what this actually means. But it's a great example of, I'm super conservative, but when you say to somebody like, the court should just follow the law. Can you imagine being a judge and trying to read this law? What does it actually say? It's like crazy people wrote it. Okay? I asked a state rep who had voted on this, what was the intent? And his answer was the intent was to basically block these things. But instead of just blocking them, we'll have some goofball language that makes it confusing to everybody. That's not what he said, told me, but it's like, why didn't they just block them? Like, well, because we wanted to have the wording. It's all political bullshit, basically. To do it certain ways, to get the governor to sign it, to get it to have a veto-proof majority, et cetera, et cetera. So this becomes law on October 13th. The irony of it is, regardless of how you feel about vaccine mandates, is we should all appreciate Ohio is a very uncompetitive state. If you look at it in the country, it's a very uncompetitive state, the way our government's structured. This stuff makes it more uncompetitive. So you have universities out there putting vaccine mandates in place, all these things, and there's a statute taking effect 2 days before the mandate goes in at Miami that would appear to block the mandate. So how much money, time, and effort is getting wasted that there might be a statute that messes it all up? So that's just a little background from my perspective. As a Miami grad, I have my own views on the vaccine and stuff like this, but I have always thought that Miami people are better. But I gotta be honest, but I hate stuff like this. This is a disgrace to even have the confusion be generated. This is not my Miami, and it's when we went to Miami, we didn't run around yelling love and honor everywhere. And to me, like, some of the people that yell love and honor everywhere I've seen are some of the most hateful, spiteful people I've ever met. Okay? I don't know if people even know that there's Latin on the Miami logo today. That means inconspicuous progress. Whatever it says. That was, when I went here, what the message was to students. That we should be making progress inconspicuously. That the people that most change our country, it's not about them. It's about making progress inconspicuously. And that's what the Latin says on the Miami seal. And that used to be what we talked about in Miami when I went here. Is that idea that it's about something bigger than yourself when you do it. Okay. So, the conscience part's another part. I think this is my last page. Is that I think a little bit unknown, and maybe Matt will talk about it. I will tell you that the state rep I talked to told me that conscience is not, Matt told me conscience wasn't defined in the law. And then I asked the state rep about it, and he said, actually there is one bill that has ever had conscience in it. There is a conscience clause for pharmacists that don't want to dispense morning after abortion medications. There is a conscience clause that was put into law. So he pointed out to me that some of the people on this vaccine stuff are looking to any cases from that, which is totally kind of unrelated, to see was there any court cases that talked about what's the definition of conscience because of that related to those people. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about that was a Miami perspective, and hopefully I haven't messed up Matt too much in this presentation.
I'm fine.
And with that, I'm going to introduce Matt Miller-Novak to talk about vaccine exemption law and his experience.
Okay. None of that was true about my importance. So, I was going to I'm going to pull a chair. I hope no one minds if I sit. One of my favorite musicians is Sam Cooke. I don't know if anybody knows Sam Cooke. He's kind of the godfather of soul. And one of the things I love about Sam Cooke is that he would sit on a stool while he sang. So if Sam Cooke can be cool on a stool, I figure so can I. Not as cool, but I'm going to try. So, I was going to try to just present today and not tell you what my political affiliations were, what everybody called me out on. So, it's my Sam Cooke stool. People can see it. All right. So I'm going to sit over here on my Sam Cooke stool, and I'm going to talk to you. So, Chris did talk a little bit about my political affiliations, but it didn't really matter. The reality is, as an attorney, so my own political affiliations don't really. Other way. Sorry. There they are. So here's a little bit about myself. My name is Matt Miller-Novak. I'm a partner at Baron Peck, Benny Schlemmer. I practice employment discrimination. I represent both employees as well as employers. I also do business litigation, government transparency, which is open meetings cases, open records cases, and I also do constitutional cases. First and 14th Amendments tend to be most of my cases, so when people get kicked out of public meetings, Chris, or other 14th Amendment issues involve equal protection cases, substantive due process, and procedural due process. So, the thing about the law and being a lawyer and the world on Facebook is very black and white, and people are very polarized these days. But when you're an attorney, you kind of have a different viewpoint in life regardless of what your own biases are. For me, the law is the law is the law is the law. Most of my clients, to tell you the truth, have very opposite political viewpoints as myself. And I actually really like that. While I might be someone who's a little bit more liberal myself, I would say I'm a very moderate guy, actually. Chris describes me as a liberal. But the reality is, I'm from Youngstown, Ohio, which is a very blue dog Democrat town. My father worked for the Bell Company. He was a union member. So my roots are kind of more like blue dog Democrat, I guess, if you had to put a generic label on it. I'm a very moderate guy. But the one thing I actually really love about doing constitutional law is that I believe in First Amendment rights. I believe in constitutional rights. And, I just have to say it, that a vast majority of my clients have a very different point of view, because in the 60s and 70s, it tended to be that the kind of victims, I guess, of First Amendment violations tended to be kind of hippies, for those of you that are a little bit older, right? People who were burning flags, people who were burning draft cards. Those were kind of the cases during the Vietnam War. One of the most popular cases is the O'Brien case, where someone wore, okay, I'm sorry, I'm gonna swear, it said "fuck the draft," and someone wore that t-shirt into a court and they were prosecuted for that. So that was a very liberal person, obviously, in the 60s and 70s. There's been a paradigm shift, and the reality is that most people nowadays who have suffered First Amendment violations tend to be more conservative and have, quite frankly, and the other people who have been kind of persecuted nowadays have more views. They're kind of like a little bit more racially challenging and things like that. Because the reality is that when it comes to First Amendment violations, the people who are usually somewhat punished for their speech is because they offend people. And the one thing you learn as a First Amendment attorney is that everybody loves the First Amendment and everybody hates it. You love it when it supports your own speech, and you hate it when it supports someone else's speech that you don't agree with that offends you. And that's the reality, and that's a commonality that exists among liberals and it exists among conservatives. I've had clients that come in my office all the time and they're like, I want to sue this government because I got kicked out of a meeting, but they also want to sue the people on the council that kicked them out because they criticized them. So there's this weird dichotomy with the First Amendment, and what you realize is everybody loves it and hates it. And when you're a First Amendment attorney, you just cast it all out and you say that the law is the law, and I'm going to uphold the Constitution when it applies and when it violates people's rights, regardless of whether or not I agree with that message. And that might sound like I'm a mercenary, and I'm cool with that, because the reality is that I get to represent people who have different viewpoints as mine, and I learn a lot about them. And actually, I think my reality, what I've learned is that most of us agree with a vast majority of things. 90% of what is in our hearts we all agree with, and maybe I'm one of the few people left in the United States of America who believe that actually we have more in common than we have different. But I'll kind of go on, and that's enough of my soapbox. I'll talk about the law now in a very mundane way. So my opening remarks, and every time I do a public speech as an attorney, I kind of go through some stuff. These are ground rules. This is a brief education. I'm going to teach you enough today to make you a danger to yourself and others around you. Your own case may or may not be satisfied with anything I'm teaching today, so please don't take anything I'm saying as legal advice for you individually. Number two, lawyers don't make the law, we just work within it. So sometimes I give people an answer that they need to hear. It's not the one they want to hear, and they get pretty pissed off about it. Just to be honest, I've had people hang up on me. I've had people cuss me out on the phone. And sorry, Charlie. I mean, some of the things that might come out of my mouth today might not be what you want to hear. It might just be reality that you need to hear. Regarding employment matters, you should always contact an attorney about your individual case before confronting your employer. Man, you know, the general rule as an employment attorney is that you don't tell your boss to piss off before you talk to an attorney. And even then, you still don't tell your boss to piss off. You know, you got to be really careful about being confrontational or breaking laws and things like that. At the end of the day, you know, if you have a question about whether or not you have certain rights in your office, don't go to Facebook. Don't assume you're right. Call an attorney. If you have to pay a couple $100s for a little bit of advice on the phone, rather than ruin your entire career, it might be some money well spent. So a couple of issues I'm going to talk about in presentation today. I'm going to talk about some employment matters with vaccine mandates. And the reason I'm starting with that, even though I know that's not why you're here, is because there's not actually a lot of case law about vaccine mandates to the public. Right? There hasn't been an overabundance of widespread pandemics that we all talk about. There's been smallpox, there's been polio, right? So there's not tons of case law in the whole public spectrum. Where we actually get more case law comes from employment law and vaccine mandates in employment areas, which is pretty much old news for some of us employment attorneys. And then I will turn towards some state mandates after that. All right, so let's start. So private employment, and I just have to put this out, as an employment attorney who's been doing it for a decade, roughly, it's the most unique time where I'm getting the same calls all the time from different kinds of people asking the same questions. Usually my questions are very varied, and I just wanted to point that out. That it's kind of neat, and at some point in time almost boring, because I feel like I'm answering the same phone call 5 times a day, where I used to have a pretty good plethora of drama. But let's go into private employment. Generally speaking, a private employer may mandate a vaccine for its employees. That might upset some people, but it's just true. COVID-19 is not treated any differently currently than previous vaccine mandates for the flu, and etc. So in employment law, obviously, I get employment calls very often. And before this year, and the year before, when the world was not talking constantly about vaccine mandates, I did get calls from people who worked at healthcare facilities, nurses and others who were required to take flu vaccines. There might be things about hepatitis, meningitis, stuff like that. So the law is actually not new. It might be a new vaccine, it might be a new disease, but the law itself, when it comes to vaccine mandates within an employment context, is not new. Various healthcare facilities have been mandating vaccines for their nurses and healthcare personnel for a really long time, okay? And the law on the subject is that generally speaking, an employer is allowed to mandate a vaccine. Okay, and we'll talk about the exceptions to that as we move forward. Regarding COVID, the EEOC issued guidance in January that the COVID vaccine would not necessarily be treated any differently than any other vaccine that's been mandated in the past. Okay? Early general challenges to mandates in healthcare have been failing. So there was a pretty well-published class action lawsuit in Texas where a group of, I believe it was around 175 nurses, filed a class action in Texas alleging that a vaccine mandate was unlawful, and the federal court dismissed it in what's called a motion for 12b-6, which is a motion for a failure to state a claim, and it was dismissed outright. Like, it didn't even get into discovery, any of that, you know? And that speaks volumes where the federal courts are on the law. And, you know, does that mean that no employee will ever have a lawsuit for a vaccine mandate? No. You know, the mistake was that was a class action saying that a general mandate was unlawful. And that was doomed to fail because there's this thing in class actions about commonality. So challenging a vaccine mandate, generally speaking, is pretty much a recipe for failure. But that does not mean that individuals will not have adequate challenges in an employment context for a vaccine mandate. That just means a class, different people have different stories. And for a class action to exist, everybody has to have the same story. So when we talk about things like religious exemptions and disability exemptions, everybody has a different religion. Everybody has different religious beliefs. Everybody has different disabilities. So a class action was never going to work. That was probably, in the end, a little bit more political than it was effective. So let's get into exemptions where people might actually have claims, okay? Because most cases have to be done on an individual basis. Class actions are extremely difficult, and I could give a whole lecture just on why class actions are extremely difficult. But anyway, so we have two primary exemptions that people will conjure up in the employment context about vaccines. One is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which everybody knows is the ADA, which technically nowadays is the ADAA because it was amended, but that's too nerdy for you. And then Title VII is religious accommodations. So let's start first with the ADA. And this stuff you'll see kind of permeates through later things, because the one thing about the ADA, it's not just employment law. So the ADA has Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3. The ADA applies to employers. It also applies to public accommodations, things like movie theaters, gyms, and stuff like that. That's why everybody who's a man here notice there's always a really low toilet when you go to pee. You know what I mean? That urinal that's like down here. That's an ADA accommodation that's required. Anybody who's ever swam in a public pool and sees a wheelchair lift, right? You see that device? Those are ADA accommodations in public things. ADA also applies to government and it applies to private employers. So that's the reason I started with employment in this lecture. So an employee must have a legitimate disability and be capable of performing her work duties with an accommodation. So what does that mean? That means you have to have a disability. And I can't remember. Oh, yeah. So I don't want to skip to it. So generally speaking, you have to be able to do your job with an accommodation. Because there's some times that you can have disabilities where you just can't do your job. Right? So imagine that, I'm going to give an extreme example, but imagine you're a truck driver with narcolepsy. Right? Can you drive a semi-truck with narcolepsy? No. Right? Not going to happen. So there are sometimes you can have disabilities that you can't, there's no such thing as an accommodation to allow you to do your job. Okay? Second, the accommodation sought must be reasonable. And then third, the accommodation must not place an undue hardship on the employer. And these things, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about reasonable versus undue hardship, they're site specific. What's good for the goose isn't always good for the gander. So sometimes, and I, as an employment attorney, I'll just go ahead and put on the record, I hate ADA law. Because I can rarely ever advise my clients about an outcome because, you know, when it comes to undue hardship, for instance, you know, what Walmart can afford to accommodate a person, maybe a mom and pop shop can. So you can have the same disability and in two different employment relationships, one is a reasonable accommodation, not an undue hardship, and the other one is. So it's very case-by-case basis, and it makes it very difficult to practice ADA law because, you know, I've had some cases like, oh my God, that sounds reasonable, and it's not because as a smaller employer, case law can be misleading and it sucks, quite frankly, in that regard. So let's talk a little bit first about what is a disability. Generally, a disability is any long-term condition that is life-limiting. People think of disabilities as stuff that gets you like, you know, a handicapped parking spot tag or something like that. No, it's much more than that, right? So it can be things that are visible, it can be things that are invisible. It's mental health, it can be anxiety, it can be depression. Those are all recognized disabilities, diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure. It can be digestive conditions, Crohn's disease, things like that. So if you're someone that has Crohn's disease, an accommodation could be, I get more bathroom breaks than the average bird, for instance, right? Having said that, what are not disabilities? The flu is a great example, something that's very temporary. Like I've got the flu this week, right? Or I don't feel well because I had a bad piece of shrimp or something like that at a restaurant. So here's the whole entire problem with the ADA. So reasonable accommodation versus undue burden. So it is case by case. So regarding reasonableness in the vaccine setting, the employer's disability must actually require the accommodation. So what I'm saying by that is just because you have a disability doesn't mean you'd be entitled to a vaccine accommodation. Okay? For instance, if your disability was, I'm blind, That has nothing to do with whether or not you can or cannot take a vaccine, right? One of the most popular examples of vaccine accommodations that I've dealt with in my practice are certain allergies. Egg allergies are very popular because a lot of vaccines are bound with these proteins that have egg products in them. So people who are allergic to eggs can almost take like no vaccine without becoming potentially very ill. So that's a prime example. But having said that, if you're going to allege that you have a disability in your workplace that exempts you from taking a vaccine, and you can't get a doctor to write that opinion, good luck. Because if it actually gets litigated, it comes down to these things called experts and expert testimony, expert witnesses. And anybody, and I don't care what the ADA case is, it might be vaccine, it might be any other ADA accommodation in the workplace that's not vaccine related. You have to prove, number one, that you have a disability, and number two, you have to prove that that disability requires the accommodation that you're requiring. I hope that's understood. So you have to be able to get some doctor that can draft a letter that says, this person requires this accommodation, right? And some things are obvious, other things are less obvious. So I would think in a vaccine mandate setting, you would have to be able to have a doctor that could draft a letter for you and would be willing to testify, and you are allowed to pay them because you're allowed to pay expert witnesses to testify that this person's disability would make it dangerous for them to take this vaccine, okay? So, but having said that, it does not end there, because a lot of people feel that it does, that I prove that I have a disability and I need this accommodation, I'm done. That's not necessarily true, because the next part of the analysis, that trust me, none of my clients want to hear, is whether or not it's an undue burden on the employer, right? So just because I have a disability that requires an accommodation doesn't mean I get it, all right? And that could be for any number of reasons. So I think I mentioned something like Crohn's disease and taking constant breaks. I think I mentioned things like mental health. You know, I've had a lot of people who've called me and they have depression or anxiety and they want to work from home. That might not work out, right? Because it's whether or not it's an undue burden on your employer for you to work from home. So to take a flip side in this current situation we're in, as I know a lot of folks here today, because of vaccine mandates and not wanting to make vaccines, but previous to now, I got a lot of calls in the very early parts of the pandemic where there were people who didn't want to go into work, right? People are like, man, I'm afraid of this. I don't want to go into work. I want to work from home. Well, okay, you might have something like, a respiratory condition, some disability that makes you afraid of catching COVID. But the reality is working from home might be an undue burden on the employer. So you might still have to go to work. That might be an actual disability. The accommodation of working from home might sound reasonable, but for some reason that might be an undue burden on the employer. School teachers are a pretty good example. Nurses are a good example. You can't be a nurse at home, right? There's some jobs where you can't work from home. The employer could never afford to allow everybody who wants to work from home to work from home. And that's where the undue burden comes into play. All right? So here's some of the factors that people look at. Essential job functions is a big one. So I mentioned things like nursing and teaching, right? An essential job function of being a nurse is to actually be in the hospital. So someone who wants to be a nurse from home, raise your hand here if you think that makes sense. What's that?
Telemedicine.
Well, telemedicine, there are some things, but if your job is being an RN in an actual hospital and EMS in an emergency room and that's your actual job, it would not be possible, right? Being a school teacher, it's probably not possible. Like things like elementary school and things like that, it becomes less and less possible. So the essential job functions is huge, right? So let's just talk about being a truck driver. Let's just get completely black and white and simplistic. If you lost your vision tomorrow, could you be a truck driver? Is there any accommodation that would allow you to keep being a truck driver? Well, that's a simple answer about it. Absolutely not, right? So that is something that the courts will look at. The other thing is the employer's target consumer. It's just a necessity. You know, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, if you're a bartender over there, right? Can you bartend from home?
Pretty well, actually.
Yeah. All right. But I would have to come on your house, though, right?
That's fair.
Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. You'd have to. I mean, I'm a terrible house guest. I might drink too much if you find a PlayStation or something like that. So, and then 3, economic considerations, right? So, economics. I know that everybody thinks that like law is all about fairness. Sometimes it's about society and economics, quite frankly. And then 4, lots of potential arguments for both the employer and the employee. And you know, we can get into this because people might have questions, so I'm not going to bother with that now. ADA applications. The ADA also applies to government institutions and public accommodations. We kind of talked about that earlier, but the analysis is very similar in the various settings. So the next thing with employment, we talk about religious exemptions. That's under Title VII. So Title VII covers religion, race, gender, and national origin. An employee must have a sincere religious belief. The accommodation must be reasonable. Sound familiar? It's very close to ADA. And the accommodations must not cause an undue burden. It's very site-specific as well. So what is religion? This is a lot of words, and you can, I guess, I didn't know this can be filmed, but you can see it on the movie. So, I only have 15 minutes left, is that what that means? Oh crap, I better hurry. So, then I'll let you read this at home, but to make a long story short, it doesn't have to be a very popular religion. Your religious belief can be slightly different than the whole entire religion. For example, the Pope says everybody should get a vaccine, but you can be a Catholic and say, my understanding of Catholicism is a little bit different, and that might work out. Religious accommodation. It's very similar, but actually it's a lesser degree. So the courts give less deferential treatment to a plaintiff who's asking for religious discrimination case than they do a disability. So it's whether or not that the accommodation you're requesting has more than a de minimis effect on the employer. So that doesn't take much. I know that Delta Airlines, for instance, has basically said, we don't care about your religious accommodations. It's too dangerous for our consumer. It's too dangerous for our fellow staff. We don't care. We'll find out when they're eventually sued, because I know they will be, who's right. Factors for religious accommodation, similar to ADA. Of course, look at the same exact things for the most side. You know, what are the potential arguments for the employer? Is that, hey, you know, by this person not being vaccinated, they're going to create a danger to our fellow employees and our clients. The employee is going to say, well, it's disruptive. Whether or not something's a sincere belief, attorneys on the defense side tend to kind of like avoid that argument, and they tend to build up heavier on the undue burden on the employer, because it's too hard to tax sincerity, and the standard of law is kind of like pretty open. Like technically speaking, being atheist is a religion under the under Title VII. So if it's religious discrimination, discriminating against someone that doesn't have a religion, that shows you that necessarily attacking that aspect of it tends to be kind of foolhardy for defense. So they tend to focus on the burdens of the employer and the reasonableness of accommodation. So let's get to state and local government mandates. State decisions of mandate vaccines and zone employees generally follows kind of the ADA in Title VII if you're a public employee. Mandates for students or citizens would create issues similar to the ADA for disability you have to look at the authority, because sometimes governments pass laws and the dude that passed the rule didn't have the ability to do it, and you can kind of invalidate law because they just didn't have the authority to do it. And that happens a lot when the executive branch does things that the legislative branch should have done. And sometimes you can invalidate a law because the wrong guy did it. And that's sometimes the quickest path, is just a wrong procedure. Look to the state legislation on point, because everything I'm talking about today can usually be overridden by state legislation. And I know we've talked about the General Assembly's law that's going to happen on October 13th, which kind of overrides most of the things I'm talking about anyways. So when it comes to vaccine mandates that are issued by the state, this is the most popular case. It's Jacobson versus Massachusetts. It's a 1905 case by John Marshall Harlan, who was a Republican, and this might piss some of you off. But the liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States, and I can read it, but I know I'm up against that paper plates time listing. So I'll sum it up. It basically says that sometimes our individual rights have to take a back seat to the greater good. And this was a vaccine mandate issued by the state of Massachusetts, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was lawful and not unconstitutional, because sometimes our individual rights have to take a back seat to the greater good. It happens all the time. We can think of seatbelt laws and many other things, and that's essentially what the court ruled in 1905. Obviously, in the vaccine debate that's happening today, liberal people like to point to this case, and non-liberal people like to ignore it. But that is the law. So disability in government. It's the same basic analysis of disability discrimination in the workplace. That's why I'm going to skip over this, because if you have a disability that prevents you from getting a vaccine, and you're being compelled to get a vaccine, you should call an attorney. Whether or not you're going to win, I can't tell you. You should talk to an attorney. But what I can say is, if you have a disability that prevents you from getting a vaccine, or the vaccine can kill you because of your disability, you should definitely call an attorney. I've got a couple clients now where that is the case. Right? And it's not right. Religion will not automatically release someone from the application of public safety laws applied evenly in a matter targeting, not targeting the religion. So a lot of people feel like if my religion exempts me from this, and this is what's interesting about both Miami's policy as well as the state law, because despite Facebook scholars and constitutional scholars, the reality is the First Amendment is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. So, and I want to pull this out, and I'm sorry if you're conservative and you believe that that's the case, this is going to really make you mad, because Justice Scalia, who is one of the most profound conservative scholars and conservative justices, would disagree with you. So he wrote this in a case of Employment Division versus Smith. And this case was about a person who took peyote as part of a religious practice and then was denied unemployment because he tested positive for peyote. And the reality is that liberals were like, you should be allowed to do that, right? And Scalia was like, no! So, most liberals were like, that's unfair. But anyway, so Scalia wrote, we have never held that an individual's religious beliefs excuse him from compliance with an otherwise valid law prohibiting conduct that the state is free to regulate. On the contrary, the record of more than a century of free exercise jurisprudence contradicts that proposition, as described succinctly by Justice Frankfurter in Murnersville School District Board of Education versus Nevada. So he writes, conscientious scruples of not in the course of long struggle for religious toleration relieve the individual from the obedience to the general law not aimed at the promotion or restriction of religious beliefs. The mere possession of religious convictions, which contradict relevant concerns of the political society, does not relieve the citizen from the discharge of political responsibility. In other words, If the law says that you cannot sell crank, and you decide to start a religion that's like, we're all about crank, and we're going to sell crank, well, that's not going to work out. And if you're a shop, it's speed, man. It's speed. Yeah, it's crystal meth. So you cannot just like have a religion that violates generally applicable laws. And we've seen some lawsuits in the COVID thing about religion and churches not being allowed to meet in person, and some of those have won and some of those have lost. The ones that have lost have been in states where the laws have been very evenly applied. The ones that have won are in states where the laws were not evenly applied, right? Where it's almost like the governor was kind of targeting a church or something like that. But generally speaking, you can't have a religion like the Branch Davidians is a great example. I mean, they had a religion where essentially people were having sex with minors. I mean, you can't do that. Just because that's part of your religious practice doesn't mean you get to do it and get to violate generally applicable laws. So one thing that's very noteworthy in this case is that Judge Scalia gives examples. He gives examples like taxes, the draft. One of the things he actually said in this case was compulsory vaccination laws. So Justice Scalia essentially said that you would not be exempt from the state's mandatory vaccination laws because of your religion. So everybody needs to understand that. There is no blanket religious exemption from a mandatory vaccine law. Don't kill the messenger. I'm just quoting Justice Scalia. Here's some other example cases that are in the PowerPoint. The Supreme Court on COVID today, we don't really know, but the only thing we have seen is that Indiana University had a mandate. It was challenged on 14th Amendment, which is substantive due process, forced medical procedures. The Seventh Circuit cited the Jacobson case that we mentioned earlier, which was the Harlan opinion, and it upheld Indiana University's vaccine mandate. The Supreme Court declined to hear it. So I think the implication is the Supreme Court has no interest in striking down blanket vaccine mandates. Does that mean that individuals can't win? Of course not. Of course not. But it means that a blanket mandate is lawful whether or not we like it on the 14th Amendment analysis. That doesn't mean that individuals won't have certain disabilities which would exempt them from that. But here's the most important thing is actual state legislation. Most vaccine mandates are state power. It's issued by a state legislature. It's not issued by the federal government. So the state legislation in any particular state can either say vaccine mandates must happen or could happen, or a state legislator could say they cannot happen. So Florida has passed state legislation where it's unlawful for local municipalities or local governments to have vaccine mandates. I think Texas did the same. And we've talked about Ohio's law, and you guys, like, spoiler alert, I feel like you spoiled my presentation. This was the conclusion of it. So we do have a state legislation here that essentially says that a public school, which is any city, local, exempted village, or general vocational school, community school, whatever, it would apply to a state university when you look at that code. State institution of higher education is the same meaning as that, which basically means where we're sitting. It wouldn't be a private college, obviously. Notwithstanding, which means regardless, that's a stupid lawyer word for regardless. Any conflicting provision of the revised code, a public school or state institution of higher education shall not do either of the following. Require an individual to receive a vaccine for the United States that's not approved by the FDA, which would not, obviously Pfizer is right now. I think Moderna was too recently. Am I wrong? But anyways, you can't discriminate against an individual who has not received the vaccine described in this section, including by requiring the individual to engage in or refrain from engaging in activities or even precautions that differ from the activity or precautions of an individual who has received the vaccine. Subsection C, this section does not apply to a hospital or other healthcare facility that's owned by or operated by or affiliated with a state institution of higher education. So how do I understand this? I'm from Cincinnati, so I'll just go in UC terms. If you go to UC, UC can have a vaccine mandate. If you don't have the vaccine, UC can't discriminate against you and say that you can't participate in certain reindeer games. But if you're an employee or you work in UC Health, they can say that you can't participate in certain reindeer games and make you take other precautions. That's how I read this. Hasn't been litigated yet. So if your answer, you're asking me to give you an answer how a particular situation we'll find out how we find out how this ends up working. For me, I agree with Chris, it's kind of a double negative. I think it's a very political way to say that probably you can have a vaccine mandate or you can't have one, but you can't enforce it. I don't like it. I feel like it's dishonest. I think you just either say you can or cannot do something. I think there's no reason or excuse to have this very roundabout, confusing law that individuals and the general public are very confused by, and that judges might be confused by, so I don't dig it. But my initial reading of this is that you can have a vaccine mandate, but you can't treat people differently for not following it, which to me equals a nothing burger.
Miami's doing that now because they're only testing unvaccinated.
What's that?
Miami is only doing random testing on the unvaccinated, is my understanding, which to me would be discrimination.
Well, but this law is not in effect until October 13th, 2021, so we'll see if they're still doing it on October 14th, 2021.
And would number 2 still be valid even though it's technically FDA approved? Does it, number 2,
Because B1 it refers, right, to a vaccine it's approved. So it's actually referring up there, so, but.
So that would still be in effect? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's stupid. I think what it was is that the legislators were like, well, we want to pass a law that basically means vaccine mandates mean nothing, but we want to pretend like we didn't do that. Because that way it makes people happy that don't like vaccine mandates, but maybe it doesn't make people angry who don't like vaccine mandates. This is what happens when you draft legislation based on political aspirations rather than drafting clear legislation. And as an attorney, it pisses me off. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I just would rather it says, it doesn't matter what my political bias is. I just like clear legislation. I just rather it says, dude, you can't have a vaccine mandate. I mean, just come out and say it and be honest. Because I think that at the end of the day, this kind of says that a public school, that its vaccine mandates probably are nothing burger.
But doesn't that, the statement that says they shall not require somebody to get a vaccine that has not been granted full approval? Well, okay, nothing was granted full approval up until a week ago.
Yeah.
Now there's 2 that have been granted full approval, so that says that they can require people to get something that's been granted full approval.
Yeah. You can't require it, but then you can't do anything about it if they don't listen to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's why this statute's stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
So
why it's going to confuse the general public, right? And I'm going to get tons of phone calls that are worthless because of this. And as an attorney, it bothers me. Because I think when you're writing legislation to kind of like couch it or hedge things, and then the problem is when people challenge this, then, judicial bias becomes vulnerable, right? Like, people can read this. Yeah, it's completely vulnerable to attack, right? Because it's written to be political rather than effective. An effective statute says what it says, right? It's like Horton, man. Like, I mean what I say and I say what I mean, right? You know, that's like an effective statute. You don't really, you don't talk around things. That's a political speech. When we're a politician, we're talking, it tends to be that people speak around things and they never really answer your question. They always stick to their 3 or 4 talking points. And that's all great for the pulpit, right? That's all great for the lectern. It's not good for legislation. And that's what bothers me about that. So the only thing I want to move on is the federal power, because this is the unknown. This is the stuff that hasn't really happened yet. And this is the stuff that as a constitutional attorney, maybe I'm most excited about because it hasn't really been ruled upon yet and there's not case law yet. So the 1905 Jacobson case we talked about by Harlan was about the state power. It was about Massachusetts and the state power to pass a vaccine mandate. There really hasn't been a case whether or not the federal government has the power to do that. So it'll be interesting to see when that happens, if it happens, how the federal government and how the Supreme Court rules on that. And there's some predictions, and I guess I just want to put it out, so I just want to be on the record. So if I'm right or wrong. So vaccine mandates for the military, would the president have the power to rule on that? What do you think?
Yes.
Yay or nay?
Yes.
I say yay, right? Where does the president have more power than he's the chief commander of the military? So could the president say that everybody in the military has to get a vaccine? Absolutely, I think so. Vaccine mandates for government employees. What do you think? Oh, I put employers in. All right, so employees. Do you think that the president can say that all federal employees have to get a vaccine? Probably would be my ruling, unless, again, they have a disability or maybe a religious exemption. I think would fall under the same standard as a private employer. Finally, vaccine mandates for private individuals. Anybody got a coin? No. Anybody got a coin? Because I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't think I have any better idea than you do. And I think if you hear anybody on Facebook saying that they have a better idea, they're probably wrong and they're full of crap. So, which leads me to my very last point. When I see the microphone, I feel like my mom kicking me out of the house or something like that. But I just want to leave one more public service announcement. You know, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I'm going to say that when it comes to the legal stuff, because as an employment attorney, like I usually don't like to give people employment advice online, but nowadays I'm like doing it all the time. Like, no, don't do what that guy said to do. So, you know, one of the things I do want to stress to people, don't listen to career decisions by people on Facebook. They don't know what they're talking about. And if anybody says that they have the answer, you should know they're lying, because I've been an employment attorney for a decade, and there's a lot of gray areas, and everybody's case is very individual. And a lot of times, I don't know how things are going to turn out until I file suit and find out. So don't ever listen to anybody's advice who's not an employment attorney or a government attorney about what your rights are. You should contact an attorney. And sometimes paying a couple $100s for legal advice might save you like a lifetime of financial ruin. So it's a pretty good investment. It's the same thing as like getting a weird mark on your skin looked at, right? If you see a weird black mole on your skin, you don't ask some idiot on Facebook whether or not it's skin cancer. You should pay a doctor to look at it.
So I'm going to interrupt. More charts, because we got to get. They've been very nice to us here. We're up against another group coming in here.
I am. So I'm going to take
So here's what we're going to do. So maybe Matt will be kind enough that when we get heaved out of here, can walk downstairs. There's a front patio. If people have questions before you take off, they can ask them individual questions out front before you have folks out of here. But I want to thank you guys for coming. I wish we'd had more time for questions, so maybe we can grab them. But I also want to be, Skippers has been super nice to us, and I want to make sure we respect the group coming in behind us. And one of the things that I left with the most informed is Matt's unbelievable knowledge of the street terms for drugs. I think that means also called Christy, Tina, Chrissy, tweet, glass, ice shards, go, whiz, chalk, and speed. I know that Matt probably knew all those terms. I know some of you didn't know what the term crank meant. But remember, I went to Miami University. He went to UC. At UC, you learn a lot of the street terms for drugs.